Welcome students. Today we'll talk about the different aspects of the soundtrack in a film. As you know that a film consists of two tracks primarily. That is the image track which contains the visuals of the entire film, and the soundtrack which contains the sound or the oral habitat of the entire film. So we'll talk about the soundtrack today, and we'll try to divide the soundtrack into many subcategories. There is a common conception that cinema or the film is a audiovisual medium where the image has a certain kind of primacy. That is, the image is more important than the soundtrack of the film. In other words, the image is something which tells us the entire story about, and the sound is there only to complete or complement the image. Now, this is a very erroneous wrong kind of misconception, because this misconception occurred because of a peculiar history of the cinematic medium. The cinema, as we know, when it started in 1895, it primarily could record and play back images and only images. And therefore, there is a conception that the images are primary in cinema, and sound, when it came later by the 1920s, end of the 1920s or so on and so forth, the sound is a later addendum. So, if the silent era cinema was cinema, therefore there can be films, there can be a cinema which does not consist of sound. Now, it is generally a misconception, because when films were being innovated, when cinema came into being, the techniques of recording and playing back sounds, for example, in gramophone records, or the techniques of broadcasting sounds, for example, in radio, they were already there. So what the early innovators and practitioners, what they were not very sure about is how to play back sound and image simultaneously in a very efficient kind of way. So the technique was already there, the technology was already there. What lacked was a kind of know-how. And we should remind ourselves that during the early silent era, the films, they didn't have any soundtrack, so there were no recorded sound in the entire film track, in the entire celluloid strip. But when the film was played in the theater, the experience was not silent, because there were musical accompaniments, and people actually laughed and reacted using noise, using speech in the sound. So the entire atmosphere was not that of hushed silence. In Japan, for example, there was a particular profession which was called the benshi, which kind of disappeared with the advent of sound cinema. What did the benshi do in Japan during the silent era? The benshi would stand by the screen where the film will be played on, and the benshi would give a running commentary of what is happening on the screen. So in that sense, the experience of silent cinema was never silent. It was rather full of noise. So, just because the early silent cinema was silent, that is, it could not record sound as such and could not play back a recorded sound along with the images. There might be a different record going on, but it was not recorded with the image. And in this kind of situation, the image got a certain kind of primacy. But that does not mean that there is a hierarchy between the sound and the image, where image becomes more important than sound. I'll give you one small example to understand that how sound is primarily more important than the image. Let's think of a screenplay. Now, what is there in the screenplay? In screenplay, we have descriptions, description of the images, we have a small delineation of the dramatic development of the images, and we have dialogues. Now, if you read a screenplay, you will understand, if you read a scene of a particular film in a screenplay, and if you see that scene on the screen, then you will understand that the scene in writing is very minimal than the scene which is being played on, because one can't actually write everything, one can't imagine everything of what is going to happen on the screen. Like, one can't imagine that who will be the actor in a screenplay, that who will be the actor and how the actor will interpret the role. Therefore, there is a minimal kind of description, which later during the recording of the image track it will complete. But think of the rest part of the screenplay. What is the majority portion of the screenplay? Does the screenplay consist of in a majority way? It consists of dialogues. So these dialogues, they are more or less complete. So in an ideal situation, just before when a film is going to be shot, before that thing which is almost completed is the dialogues, what the actors in a feature film, what the actors will say on screen. Therefore, one can say in a screenplay, the soundtrack is more complete than the image track, because in a screenplay it is mandatory to write down what are the important sound effects, important dramatic sound effects as such. There will be more sound effects, there will be more sound which will be added later on. So one can say that in the status of a screenplay, during the stage of the screenplay, what is more defined, more complete is the soundtrack rather than the image track through dialogues and incidental sounds. How can we categorize the soundtrack? Now we will understand that why the soundtrack is more complex than the image track. The image track roughly consists of a single layer. If we disregard the computer generated images, that is the CGI and the graphics. In graphics there will be many layers of images, but in case of a normally shot film, there will be a single layer of images. If you think of the soundtrack, there will be many different layers altogether. There will be speech, that is what the actors are saying. There will be incidental sounds, that is the sounds which happen because of the action. There will be the ambient sounds, that is the sound which is creating the ambience of the entire scene. There will be music, and there might be other sound effects. Now let us talk about these few elements one by one. Now, the dialogue or human speech gets the most primacy in a way, gets the most primacy in a conventional fiction film or in a documentary film. Why does the dialogue why does it gain so much importance? Because in a way, the dialogue is that part of the soundtrack which generates meaning in a more concrete way. That is, the other sound effects, they also generate meaning, but they are relatively abstract than the dialogue, which becomes meaningful to us. So, in a conventional film, one must keep the dialogue track very clear, very legible. Therefore, the dialogue track cannot immerse itself into the rest of the sound. Now, let us think of a situation. Supposedly, you are in a restaurant. In a restaurant, you are talking with your friend, and that restaurant is full of other people. So you will see that in the restaurant, actually your voice and your friend's voice, they are getting submerged into the other voices and the chaos which is happening in the entire restaurant. So if this scene is to be shot in film, one can keep it the way it actually happens in real life, because in the film, just so that the spectator can clearly follow the dialogues, legibly follow the dialogues, the speech of the important protagonist, they will be in a different layer than the rest of the speeches, which are less important, which is not contributing to the story, but they are merely creating an atmosphere, a mood. So one does not actually experience sound that way in real life. If in a room full of crowd, there people are chattering always, you don't actually pick up and select the speeches which you are considering important of people whom you are talking to from the rest. You can filter it out. But in film, it's possible to lay them in different kind of layers, and that is how the speech is recorded. Now, speech does not always necessarily mean dialogue. There are dialogues. There will be few dialogues which are synchronized with the image. That is, the lip movement and the dialogue, they will be synchronized. There will be many dialogues which are not synchronized. That is, you can't actually see the source of the sound. That is the face of the character who is speaking. Might be the image is showing someone who is listening. So the face of the speaker is off the screen. So there can be synced sound, synchronized sound, there can be non-synchronized sound. Non-synchronized sound means where the sound which we can hear is not in sync with the image. Why? Because the source of the sound is not heard. Think of a room where there is a hum of the air condition, or a room where there is the whirling of a fan. You don't necessarily show the AC machine, you don't necessarily show the fan, but its sound will be heard. But since that sound, we don't see the source of the sound, they are not synchronous sound. They are non-synchronous sound as such. So the voice can be synchronized, voice can be non-synchronized, and even so there can be other kind of categories too. So therefore there can be dialogues which are synchronized, and there can be voiceovers, and there can be off voice. So what is a off voice? Off voice is that kind of voice whose source you can't see, which is a kind of voice which is off the camera. So, and voiceover narration is a kind of narration, is a kind of speech which is coming out of the world of the film. So supposedly a film is beginning and a rich baritone voice is actually telling you, is presenting to you a prelude of the entire film. Now this voice is of a character whom you don't see, who is a commentator, who is like a commentator of the entire film. So you can't say that the status of this character, this nameless character who is presenting with the story, and the status of another character who is part of the story world but whom we can't see is similar. So in case of a voiceover, mainly we see that the voiceover is given by a voice who in a fiction film who is beyond the story world. On the other hand, in case of off voice, it's generally of characters who are the part of the story world but whom we can't see. Apart from the voiceover, there are other areas of sound also there on the screen. As we talked about the AC machine, we talked about the fan whirling, so on and so forth. So this kind of sound, which is not generating a kind of meaning in the entire story, but this kind of sound, it creates a kind of ambience of the entire thing. So these are called the ambient sound. We should remember the ambience are not always elemental sounds, that is the sound which is happening somewhere, in a car, in a machine, or so on and so forth. Certain qualities of sound, they also lead to a kind of ambience. Think of the reverb, think of the echo, think of a man who is talking in a big theater, and think of the same man who is talking in a small bathroom. There will be two different kind of echoes, two different kind of reverbs. In that sense, these echoes and reverbs, they are doing something very important in the film. They are creating a sense of space. Now, this ambient sound mainly do not create meaning, they create a sense of space, they create a sense of habitat, and in that way they are actually creating a context in which the rest of the speech is happening. So, if supposedly if we are trying to show a big hall in where there are many characters, but we are supposed to watch one or two characters, then continuously in each and every shot we are not necessarily showing the hall in entirety. We are going closer to the characters where the entirety of the hall is not shown. Then how will that bigness, this largeness of the hall, how will it be communicated? It will be communicated through sound, through the ambient sound, so on and so forth. Apart from the ambient sound, there will be incidental sounds. Now, incidental sounds are a bit different from the ambient sounds. What are incidental sounds? Incidental sounds are sounds which are part of the story, which is happening because of certain actions on the screen. Supposedly, a character is opening a door, closing a door, a character is pouring himself a glass of water, so on and so forth. Here, the sound of the door closing, the sound of the door opening, the sound of the opening of fridge, taking up of a bottle, opening the bottle, pouring the glass into water into the glass. This will create certain incidental sounds. These sounds are happening because of it has a cue in the image. So these are called the incidental sounds. Mainly, the incidental sounds have to be very carefully created because the incidental sounds can actually create much of the drama. Think of a fight scene. Mainly in cinema, we'll see that certain sound effects happen when someone is punched or when someone is kicked or something like that. And these sound effects are not the sound effects which we hear in our daily life. So these are more enhanced sound. Why are these sounds being enhanced? Because the entire scene has a certain kind of dramatic. The sound designing of the scene must have something in it which makes it different from the rest of the sound. So similarly, there are incidental sounds and there are ambient sounds, and apart from that, there will be certain noise effects, certain sound effects. Now the noise effects and the sound effects, they also might not be the same thing. Think of the famous scene in Hrithik Ghatak's Meghe Thaka Tara, where the main character, the protagonist, is coming down the stairs and we hear sounds of whiplashes. So we can identify the sound. And it's important to identify the sound, but no one is whipping the character. There are no whips seen on the screen. This entire thing is an effect, but this entire thing must be shown in a certain kind of way, must be actually presented, played back in a certain kind of way, so that the audience or the spectator identifies it as a whiplash. For example, in Pather Pachali, then there is a scene, the death of Indira Thakurun, when the old woman actually she falls and her head creates a thud in the ground. Now this sound didn't happen because of the actor falling and the head hitting the ground. This sound was added in a different kind of way to the soundtrack, and it was this sound was not made by someone falling on the ground. So in that case, we should not identify the sound as it is. We must think, it must be believable that this sound is coming because of a dead woman's head hitting the ground. But in case of Ritik Ghatok's Megheta Katara, the whiplash must be identifiable, must sound like a whiplash, otherwise the entire meaning which is to be generated will not be found. So the whiplash is not a diegetic sound. That is, it's not a sound which is part of the story world. It's an effect. It's a meaning-making effect which comes from the exterior of the entire diegetic world. So these are called the sound effects, and these sound effects can be sound effects which is recorded by the Foley artist. The Foley artist is a very important and very underrated profession in cinema. A particular man who goes on recording this incidental kind of sounds, which will be added later in the film track. So Foley artist might be recording sounds, and there might be other sounds which are entirely artificially produced. That is, they are produced digitally through kind of different softwares and so on and so forth. In a way, this different kind of sound effects which are digitally produced sound, this has come in a very later part of the medium in the history of the medium, when the digital technology they kind of developed in a kind of way. Apart from this, there is one important aspect, a very known aspect to us, which is very important in sound. It supports the entire film in a big way, which is the music. Now, we in Indian cinema, we use music in a very unique kind of way through as you know, through in our song sequences, through the method of playback singing, and we must have a kind of pride within ourselves, because playback is a certain thing which the other countries cannot use so efficiently the way we use it. Now, the playback system of presenting songs was innovated in India. Why? Because in Indian entertainment, the music plays a very big role. The music also can be diegetic or non-diegetic. Mainly, it's non-diegetic, but it can be also diegetic. That is, the music can be played in the image. The character is singing, therefore it's a diegetic music. But we are seeing a montage of actions and things, and the song is going on, and the source of the song, that is who is singing, is not seen on the screen. So in this case, it will be non-diegetic music. So music is something which is not only presented in songs. Music is presented all over the film, because music helps the filmmaker to create a sense of commentary. Through music, the affect is heightened or lowered, the dramatic emphasis is given, and so the entire film track will have bits and parts of music in a way which is used in an operatic way. There is a famous scene, the first scene of Federico Fellini's 8½. It's a dream scene. It shows a kind of traffic jam in which a character is actually stuck. Now, if you hear the entire scene carefully, then you will see that the use of the incidental sound, the use of ambient sound is so important in the entire film. Because think of a traffic jam, convey the idea of a man getting suffocated in a traffic jam. What does Fellini do? Fellini cuts off the entire sound. And the only sound we can hear is the sound within the car in which the character is trapped. We can hear no other sounds. Then, when the character escapes from that car and kinds of feels liberated, slowly the sound of winds, etc. come in. But immediately, Fellini has to bring back that suffocation back again. what do we see? We see that there is a great panoramic vision of a beach by the sea. He creates a different ambience. We hear certain people talking, and it seems that they are talking very close to our ears. It's a horse hooves. What we can hear only is the voice of a man who is supposedly speaking very close to our ears. And in this way, the entire sense of space, though a big wide panoramic vision is shown up there on the screen, but the entire sense of space get restricted to a very small kind of space, and it becomes very suffocating, and immediately the dream kind of it breaks. So 8.5 would be a very good example of how sound is used to create a sense of space. So in today's lecture, we have talked about the different aspects of the soundtrack, how the soundtrack can be subcategorized into many other categories, and how it creates a very complex kind of fabric on which the image track stands. So I think after this lecture, you will understand that there is not necessarily hierarchy between the image and the sound and the image is not necessarily more important than the soundtrack.